This conference will now be recorded.
Thank you. All right, and welcome to Climate Justice and Why Churches Should Care. My name is Allison Carr, and I am the Associate Secretary of Justice Ministries here at the Presbyterian Church in Canada. And so today we're going to be looking at the question of what climate justice is, why churches should care about it, looking a bit at some of the history of the environment movement and how we've come to where we're at today. As you just heard, this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted later online for people who weren't able to make it to the webinar. Everyone is on mute and your webcams are turned off just so that there aren't any problems with feedback and things of that nature for this presentation. If you do have questions or you want to ask anything, just use the chat feature icon to ask those questions. You'll have to type them out because my computer is apparently not giving me any audio that's coming back. So if you have trouble hearing me or have any questions about the material, please just type them out and I will see them on the chat. So the first thing that I wanted to look at today are just some of the breadth of protests and actions that are happening. You can see on the screen here different pictures from around the world of people coming together and saying climate justice is a real issue, climate change is a real issue, and we want to do something about it. So that's a lot of people coming around this issue and saying, you know, we need a change. So I'm just putting the question out there, how did we get here? Some of these pictures are from the climate strike that happened recently. Some of them are from other climate-related gatherings. You can see, of course, Greta Thunberg there. And so what is mobilizing all of this energy around climate justice at the time? Well, in order to be able to answer that question, it's easiest to look at, well, what is climate justice? And just sort of get ourselves clear on what that means. So what is it? What is climate justice? When we talk about climate justice, it's important to understand what the term is and where it's coming from. And so I've laid out three sort of things to think about when we're thinking about defining climate justice here. And that's that discussions of climate justice are rooted in human relations to what we commonly call the environment, that is the rest of creation, right, and to each other. So this is a relational thing that we're talking about, and it's a relational thing of humans to creation, humans to the environment. I see that there's some more people that have just come on the webinar. If you have any questions or if you have trouble hearing, please use the chat function to type, and I will see questions there. So that first part of what climate justice is that rooted in human relations. The second part is that these discussions around climate justice are centered on observations of harm by humans to the environment. So one of the way that this harm is measured is by observing changes in the Earth's climate. So previously, you know, we used to we often spoke about environmentalism. We spoke about maybe climate change or global warming or things of that nature. And now some of that language is switching to climate justice. And this is in part due to some of the observations, right? Scientists measuring what sort of impact is happening. And the easiest way to look at those measurements, or one of the easier ways, is by seeing its impact on climate and seeing how climate changes. So the third point is that speaking of climate justice sets these observed harms in a framework of right and wrong relationship, as well as legal and moral responsibilities and rights language. So when we're talking about justice, instead of talking about climate change, when we're talking about climate justice, then we're making some claims just with using that word justice. We're setting that in those frames of either there's some rights language going on, there's some responsibilities language going on, and there's some relationship language going on. So those are all things to keep in mind as we move through this webinar on climate justice. So I'm asking the question here, and I've said Christians must care about climate justice. That is, of course, a claim on my part. Some people might disagree with me, and that's fair. But I've put it here, why must Christians care about climate justice? Well, the first thing that I think it's really important to recognize is that Christians, we should love what God loves and treat as very good what God called very good, right? And if we look through the Bible, there are so many different places in the Bible where we can see God loving the creation that God made and calling it very good. If we go to Job, for example, at the very end of the book of Job, there is a long speech that God gives about, were you there when creation was made? Were you there? Do you know how to make sure that the raven's young get fed? Right? And God goes into some detail about what creation is that shows to Job and to any reader of Job just how much God knows and cares about even the intricate, little details of creation. When blades of grass go missing, when ravens young go hungry, when mountain goats are born, these kinds of things. So God has called creation very good, and we should then treat it as such. Now, the next point, however, is more sort of human, human-led. Harm to this very good creation also that affects the climate also affects humans, right? So when we harm creation enough so that it changes things like climate, it changes the soil, it changes where waters are going and things of that nature, we actually harm each other. We harm other humans. By, and I've listed some things here, right? By increasing food scarcity through flooding and droughts, by increasing instability that leads to violence through unrest, that are often caused by things like resources drying up. We can see, that around the world, when people go hungry, well, humans don't react very well to being hungry, and it frequently causes, significant unrest, sometimes violence. And that third point, increasing the potential for more extreme and destructive weather that that has a bad impact on people's livelihoods, on people's homes, and on their lives even, and sometimes it's a matter of life and death. So this problem of food scarcity and instability and the destruction of properties, of homes, of schools, of all of the things that that help humans have more secure lives. These are all a consequence of harm that has been done through various means to the environment, to creation, right? And it's important then to remember that Christians are called to show love by caring for people in need and by working for justice to address concrete issues like warmth and housing and security and food. These are the kinds of things, right, that Jesus said, whatever you do to the least of these, you do it to me. And so right now we're in a situation where we're looking at the world, and not just the world, but even here in Canada. I was reading just a few days ago about some of the harvest in some of the areas of Canada, particularly the prairies right now, and it's just been a very bad year for harvest, and that's leading to all sorts of different problems. Part of which is from the weather, right? It's just been, there was early snow this year, early cold, and some of the pictures I've seen of canola fields under snow. Well, that's, yeah, it leads to hardship. So how do we then show love? How do we show caring for people wherever they are, who are in need, and how do we help address these concrete issues like warmth and housing, security, and food? Well, one of the things that it's important to look at in order to answer those questions is to ask this other question that I've got up here now. Who or what should have justice? And that's really sort of the background of talking about climate justice, is this notion of who or what should have justice. And there's a couple of different frameworks that we'll look at before we get into some of the things that the church is doing and can do. Another way of putting the matter is who or what should have rights, and what would a just world look like? So we'll be looking at that. Now, keep those questions in the back of your mind for just a minute while we're going to work through a very, very brief and somewhat selective history of the environment and justice, some of the thought and reflection on environmental issues, and where this notion of climate justice originated. So one of the first places that people often go is to this work, Silent Spring, which many of you have probably heard of. It is quite old now, published more than 55 years ago. Silent Spring was, of course, a look at some of what pesticides, the issues that pesticides were causing. And so this book was one of the very first things that really had people talking about the environment and about setting that issue of the environment in terms of rights. So what was Carson's claim in Silent Spring? And this is, of course, in a U.S. framework that she wrote this, but it wasn't just, about the U.S., but she talks about the Bill of Rights here. And let's just look briefly at what she says. If the Bill of Rights contains no guarantee, she said, that a citizen shall be secure against lethal poisons distributed either by private individuals or by public officials, it is surely only because our forefathers, despite their considerable wisdom and foresight, could conceive of no such problem. She said, just the fact that there's no guarantee against being, having your environment poisoned for you in the environment, in the Constitution, doesn't mean that that the forefathers who set that up didn't think that it was a worthwhile thing to protect. It was just that they could not possibly conceive of having that problem. Now she adds then that it is the public that's being asked to assume the risks that this insect controllers calculate, right, for the insecticides. So she says the public then has to decide whether it wishes to continue on the present road. And she says it can only do so when in full possession of the facts. And then she quotes Jean Rostand, the obligation to endure gives us the right to know. So here she's listed this as a right to know. Now, we're not going to really talk much about the specifics of her claims about pesticides because we have so much more new data on that, and there are different issues today. But what I really wanted to highlight from her work is that she sets this in the issues of a rights framework, right? A right to not be poisoned, not just by your next door neighbor, but by the government. She says there's a right to know what's in the products that we use and what effects those products have, because we have to make decisions, she says. Also, she mentions there's a possible conflict, that the industry also has a right to make money. She says at any cost, but there is a sense that people have a right to try to sort out what their economy is going to be, how to support themselves. So she puts all of these rights sort of on the table and says, look, we have to figure out how to navigate all of these rights. Now, what is the basis of these rights that she's claiming? Well, we know that she's talking about legal rights because she's talking about the Bill of Rights, which is, of course, a legal document. But she's noting that these rights should be enforced, but they're not. And she eventually starts claiming that these are human rights. Now, I think that it's important to note that of the people who talk about human rights, many of them trace that concept of human rights as growing out of this teaching that humans are made in the image of God. And so there's this argument that we have rights as humans because of that imago Dei, right? Because we're made in the image of God, we reflect God's image, and that's sort of the locus of why we have specific and inalienable rights. We'll have to trace that lineage for another time, but I think it's worth keeping in mind that this concept of human rights that comes in many senses from a religious background, wherever it goes today. Now, there's another author, and we'll be looking at his model in just a second, and then we'll move to talk about what all this means and how we can put it together and what the church can do. But this Christopher Stone wrote a book called "Should Trees Have Standing?" and it was written, not terribly long after Silent Spring, so we're still working quite a while ago, now in the 70s. But for him, he says, look, we can talk about human rights all we want, but what about the rights of other things? Maybe the rights of the land, maybe the rights of the water and trees. And this is how we get back to that question, who or what should have rights, right? And I've included a picture here of my dog trying to remind me that he indeed also has rights, and he would like his rights to have some exercise and walk respected instead of me working. So who or what should have rights? Now this leads us to two different sort of rights framework when we talk about climate justice. You can see them here, right? There's the Universal Declaration of River Rights, and then here's this photo of people marching saying, "Dear people of the future, we are trying. Love your ancestors." And so one of these, the one that's mostly blue that talks about the rivers, it is arguing that rivers themselves have rights, right? The right to flow, for example, it says, the right to be free from pollution, the right to native biodiversity. And then, it goes through, well, how do we protect these rights? It goes towards that guardian model that Stone is advocating, that we'll see in just a second. But on the other hand, we have this picture that says, that's looking at the environment as a human right. Dear people of the future, we're trying to protect your rights of the future. We're trying to imagine what the world would be, in the future, so that we can protect your rights, even though you're not born yet, right? That's where that picture is coming from. So what is this guardianship model? Now, Stone argues that just in the same way that one can petition to become the guardian, for example, of someone who's going through dementia, or someone who has become incapacitated, medically or through an accident, someone who can no longer make good decisions for their well-being. So too, he says, we should be able to extend that legal mechanism to natural objects like trees. Now, what is his argument there? He says, it's not inevitable, nor is it wise, that natural objects should have no rights to seek redress on their own behalf. Then he says it's no answer to say that streams and forests cannot have standing, because streams and forests cannot speak. He notes that corporations can't speak either, nor can states or estates or infants or incompetents, this is 1970s language, municipalities or universities. He says lawyers speak for them, as they customarily do for the ordinary citizen with legal problems. And that's an interesting point. But he does say, look, there's also some possible objections to my argument. And the first among them, or primary among them, is, do we really know? Can we really claim to know what a group of trees needs? And here's my dog again, Wash, possibly contemplating the needs of this plant, which for those of you who may or may not garden, if you know what this plant is, it's Angelica. It's an interesting plant because it's very sugary. Um, you know, one of the things that people use Angelica for is candy. Like they use it to make candied Angelica, you know, put it on top of cakes and things of that nature. And so when I started growing it, I had a huge problem with aphids in my garden. But I noticed that as soon as I started growing Angelica, the aphids abandoned all of the rest of my garden, and they eat this Angelica down to nothing every year. This poor Angelica dies every single year. It's like the sacrificial plant in my garden, but those aphids leave everything else alone. Now, that's great for all of my other plants, but maybe not so great for the Angelica. So do we know what plants need? And then how do we balance that? That's another interesting question. Now, he says, yes, we often do know what natural objects, what plants need. In fact, they make it quite obvious, right? Here's this wilted basil. We water it, and suddenly everything is fine. All it needs is some water and some sun and some soil. Now, I'm not saying that I disagree with Stone's argument, but I think that it's really worth asking whether we do always know what a tree or a group of trees or a river or whatever needs, right? Do we always know that? And I think it's also worth saying that we haven't, humanity, always really done well by what we have had under guardianship, right? So this guardian model raises many questions. Should trees and other natural objects be defined as persons with legal standing? That's the first obvious question, right? And then you have to ask, well, what counts as major? You know, is it this particular tree? Is it this bunch of trees? Is it this section of a river? What about a creek? What about the ocean, right? How broad should that status be? So you can see here that I have, I've put a picture of redwoods. You can see some birches. This is the Mississippi River, or a section of it that you can see there, and then of course the ocean. And each of these different examples raises some interesting questions. Redwoods, as you know, can live for thousands of years, and we'll look at them in a minute. Birch trees only live, you know, maybe 70 years. And so the needs of a birch tree versus the needs of a redwood are going to be very different. Likewise with, you know, the Mississippi River versus, you know, some tiny river in Toronto or something, you know, maybe out in the countryside, out by where I live. Those are going to be very different needs. And the ocean, wow, how do we know what the ocean needs? Now, there are many words that one might think of to describe a giant redwood, I know, right? But incompetent isn't generally one of them that springs to mind. It's an issue of saying, how do we know the needs, right? The needs of a redwood are a lot more complicated than a basil plant. It's just a whole different scale, as I note here. And here's indeed a picture of me trying to learn about redwoods when I was, I think, 8. If you think about it, right, I can understand the basil's needs in part because I can see it grow and I see it develop. I see its entire lifespan, right? But the redwood, I don't. I can't see its lifespan. I just get a tiny little section of its lifespan while I'm alive. The same with the river. They were here long before me and will likely be here long after me. So in terms of time, my life resembles that mayfly in the context of their lives. If you know much about mayflies, they're only alive for just a few days, right? A few days. And so to us, they seem like just a blip. But to a redwood, that's what I would be like, just that blip. Now, even assuming that this mayfly, if we were to think of this mayfly, was sentient and rational, which that's an assumption, but let's assume it for a moment, would that mayfly ever truly be able to understand my needs as a human when it lives for such a short time relative to me? Whether it understood my needs or not, I think it's worth having that thought experiment, right? Let's say for a moment that mayflies developed this just intense, sophisticated, massive civilization, and it had so many technological advancements. They had so much together, and it was allowing them to make all sorts of improvements on their lives. But what was it doing to my life? Well, if their improvements encroached on my ability to flourish and maybe even encroached on my life, I would want them thinking about what my needs are, even if I didn't think they could really conceive of my needs in that relatively short time that's given to any particular mayfly. So what I would want is for them to have a plan that considered my needs and my rights with good follow through across their generations, right? So how do we make such a plan? Speaking now as the mayfly. And this is where many people get into the rights language and why we end up talking about climate justice. So this question leads us to that second possible model of framework, protecting the environment across generations by framing living in a safe and healthy environment as a basic human right, right? And then we would add also a duty, given what we have said earlier about creation being created very good and respecting it. So let's just look for a brief moment at some of the argument for needing environmental rights, working from that human rights basis. So this is David R. Boyd, who is an environmental lawyer, and this is only, I think, maybe 5 or 10 years old. It's much newer. So he wants to set this discussion of the environment and justice in the context of human rights. And he also opens by quoting Rachel Carson, right, from Silent Spring. As she said, I speak not as a lawyer, but as a biologist and a human being, but I strongly feel that this is or ought to be one of the basic human rights. So he wants to have these constitutional rights to a healthy environment. Now, what are some defining characteristics of human rights so that we know what we're getting into when we say, okay, let's make this a human rights issue? So he says, look, there's 3 different things that a right has to have in order for it to be a human right. So it must be universal. It has to be applicable to all humans in order to be a human right. It has to be moral, and what he means by that is that it has to exist whether or not a particular nation, government, or legal system recognizes it. So, you know, if I can say, wow, it's a human right to, you know, not have your government, you know, shoot you on the street, let's say, then even if a government were to go about and shoot its citizens on the street, then you could say, no, that's not acceptable. That's not moral. That you can't do that. Even though you are doing it, it's wrong. You have to be able to say that for it to be a human right. And then thirdly, it has to be essential to human life. And by that, he means, quote, ensuring the dignity and quality of life of, again, all human beings. So is it essential in the sense that if you take air away from me, then I will, of course, die? That's not quite what he means by essential. He's defining that as dignity and quality of life. So there are these 5 compelling reasons that he gives for why we should have a healthy environment as a constitutional right. And we don't have to go over all of them here. You can take a look at them. I think that he raises some good points. He says, well, first of all, let's not poison ourselves. That's probably a good one. And he says, look, environmental protection has become a fundamental value held by the overwhelming majority of Canadians. And I think that he's largely right there. We don't always agree on what that environmental protection should look like. We don't agree on how to approach it, how to make sure that it happens. But I think many people do agree, yes, the environment is something worth protecting. And then we have to negotiate what is the best way to do that, and how do we balance it with human needs. Then there's the last one that he mentions here. Environmental rights and responsibilities are fundamental elements of Indigenous law, and he says acknowledging them would mark an important step towards reconciliation. And I think that too is worth mentioning. So that gets us back to the question, who or what has rights? Now, when he raises that last point, the one about recognizing Indigenous law, he is framing this notion of the earth having rights, but in a slightly different way than we saw Stone earlier, right? Christopher Stone. Now, Christopher Stone was saying the land, the earth has rights, and so we have to have this guardianship model because it's incompetent and can't speak for itself. But Boyd is saying no. Here, we're tying these rights with the land's almost personhood, right? The land's sentience is another way of using that. The land's ability to relate to people and to other creatures. So he says one of the bedrock elements of Indigenous law common to many Aboriginal societies is that idea of a living earth with a set of rights and responsibilities governing the relationships between humans and the natural world. And he says, as John Barrows has written, the land's sentience is a fundamental principle of Anishinaabeg law, and it contributes to a multiplicity of citizenship rights and responsibilities for Anishinaabe people and for the earth. So again, this is a very relational model. Now, if we looked at creation through the different lenses that we briefly discussed here, Stone's guardianship model, Lloyd's human rights model, and what Barrows has identified as this relationship model for people on the earth, what do you think we would see? I'm going to use an example just to briefly, reflect on what that is. So you'll see here in the picture that there's a little statue, and I'm holding the statue there. This is taken on the shore of Lake Ontario, not terribly far from my house. I spend a lot of time during my free time walking the lake shore. I often pick up garbage. I also I collect rocks, but on this particular day, I found this tiny little statue. Now this little statue, it was plastic, is of Saint Anthony of Padua, right? And if you know anything about the patron saints, you may know that he happens to be the patron saint of lost items, which I found a little ironic and funny, given that he had indeed washed up on the shore lost of Lake Ontario. But then I asked myself, well, this is actually a really beautiful metaphor. What can we learn from Saint Anthony, right? Who also was a real student of Scripture, and was, you can see right there, he's carrying Jesus in his arms. That baby who is next to him is known as Jesus because he had such a reputation for caring deeply about what Scripture said, and was frequently imaged in that way. So what can we learn from Saint Anthony about what we're called to do? The next picture that I'm showing, this is just some of the garbage that I've picked up off the lake. I did this as a way of just trying to see what am I finding along the lake shore? What sorts of consumption patterns am I seeing what can I see in my life that I use that ends up as garbage on the lakeshore? Hopefully not from me directly. I try very hard to recycle, of course. But the more I found the objects along the lake and looked at how they were similar to objects that I used in my life, the more I was able to start zeroing in on what do I really need to use in my life and what can I cut out, and seeing where all of this plastic is coming from. So you can see there's a little purple circle there. And then I've got a pamphlet that I also found along the lake shore. And again, I found that just a really important thing that made me pause as I was picking up garbage and found this pamphlet. It talks about God loving the world so much that God gave his only son, so that we would not perish. And when I saw that in the context of all of the garbage that I had collected off of the shore, it really hit me, that God does love the world so much, and how good of a job am I doing at taking care of it? And I think the answer is, well, at least for me, I know I could do a lot better. So part of what climate justice is trying to raise, and some of the actions that are going on around climate justice, is trying to disrupt that sense of what's normal, because what's normal has led us to that picture that you just saw with all of the different garbage. I encourage you to look back at that picture at some point, or to indeed take a walk along some water in your own area, wherever that is. If it's a river, if it's a creek, if it's even just out, along a street, whether there's water or not, just to see what types of garbage are ending up there, and to see, what are the types of things that that I too am using, and that now I see. It just makes you much more aware of some of the patterns and habits in our own life. So part of this disrupting what's normal is trying to really be reflective about what it is that we do in our life, how we act, how we treat creation, what sort of witness are we giving with our actions and our inactions. So what can the church do? I've gone through several suggestions here. One of the things that we can do is examine our reports, our practices as a church. Are we demonstrating care and justice for what God called very good? And so, one of the things that I'm doing right now is trying to put together some recommendations on how the church as a national body could go about demonstrating even greater care for creation. We can speak up about being called to pursue justice, including climate justice. With our friends, with our family, to say, no, this is something that's very important. That is something that that we should care about. We can look for ways to change our habits and change our work habits, our consumption, both at work and at home. Whether that's trying to take transit more frequently, whether that's printing less items, whether that's thinking about sort of the packaging and the food that you take, when you take your lunches. There's all sorts of little things that can actually make changes in the way that we live our lives. One of the big things that is one of the easiest ways to have less of an impact on the environment is to travel less. And when we travel, to use means that are less carbon intensive. So, take the train or a bus instead of flying, things of that nature. Those can help. We can look for ways that we can be climate justice role models. There's quite a bit of information on things the PCC has already done, and ways that the PCC has been a leader in some ways. in our social action handbook. So I do encourage you to go and read through that social action handbook. It is quite long, so look for the sections that you're interested in. But we really do speak out and can be a role model and can be a voice saying, creation matters. We can lower and offset our carbon footprint in our churches, at work, at home, and we can do that prophetic witness, using less resources, reflecting faithfully on the way that we relate to creation. And that doesn't have to be standing on the corner with a sign, although that can be. It can just be in the way that you live your life, and the reflection that you're able to give on why it matters that you're trying to care for creation, that you're trying to pursue climate justice. And we're not alone in this, of course. There are many, there are other churches that are engaged in climate justice. There are other ecumenical and non-government and interfaith groups. I've listed a few here. Kairos, of course, has many worship and advocacy resources around climate and ecological justice. They have quite a bit on water in particular. For those of you who know the Canadian Council of Churches, they have a commission on justice and peace, and it has just named climate as one of its 3 major foci. So that's another group that is starting to put together, trying to put together materials on how Christians can become involved in climate justice. There's many other ecumenical and interfaith partners, and when we talk and work with other groups, we can have strength and creativity in numbers, as I say here. For those of you who know Citizens for Public Justice, that's a group that runs a Lenten project called Give It Up for the Earth. So that's another group, just as an example of one way that the Christians are engaging in justice for the climate. Even speaking to government officials, right, at all levels, municipal, provincial, federal, letting them know that this is important to you, their constituent. Your MPs, asking your MPs where their parties stand on climate justice, letting people know that this is important to you, and that that it matters, and that you're looking at what they're doing. Those types of actions can help too. So in closing, whatever actions we take, I note, and I think that I didn't really go over the doom and gloom reports here. We could, but I'm trying to focus on the things that we can do instead, because I think we all understand that we're facing some difficult issues here. So I would say action is surely needed. That our response to this crisis of climate change and the harm that we've caused in creation, it has to be fully rooted in our lived faith, I would say. And I say this because the earth matters to God, and as I've said here, therefore, as people of faith, the earth must matter to us too. And not just the earth, but the earth supports us, the water supports us, the air supports us. When we harm those things, we also harm humans as well. So that's the presentation for now. I'm going to throw the floor open to questions at this point. And unfortunately, I can't hear people. There's been some problem with my audio, but I can see. So if you type questions, you can send them to me, and I'm going to give people a minute to type if there's any questions on any of the material that I've sent here, anything having to do with climate justice, anything that's sort of on your mind, anything at all. So I think that, oh, okay, yep. One of the questions is that, let's see, one of the questions is, are there places that, that we could find out more information about how to get involved at the local level? And I think that mentioning, thank you very much, the local level is very important. It's of course important to get involved with many different issues at a federal level, even at an international level. But the local level is where um, a lot of climate initiatives happen. And so most cities do have initiatives. They do have working groups on either the environmental climate, depending on how the city sets it up. I do encourage everyone to go and see what's available in your specific locale. I know in Ajax, which is where I live at now. When I was out walking one day, and again at the lake shore, I noticed an oil spill in the water, and I was able to go back to the city and say, here's my concern. This is where it is. They were able to send someone out. So it's municipality specific as to what some of the local actions are. Certainly, you can work with see who else is sort of like-minded in your congregations. Find out just through talking to people at the congregation, what are people involved with. We have a previous webinar called How to Green Your Congregation that is available if people are interested. And I have been working on the information that people have sent me about various initiatives that their congregations are involved in when it comes to the environment, whether that's through things like trying to make sure that their energy is more green, that they're making community gardens or pollinator gardens, that they're getting involved in some of the areas that have flooding relief, things of that nature. There's many different ways to get involved in issues around climate justice. So thank you. Are there any other questions? All right. Well, I'm not seeing any questions coming in. If you do have questions or want to talk more about this, if you have any feedback on the presentation, because I am hoping, of course, to always improve the work we're doing here. If please feel free to email me and or to give me a call here at Justice Ministries. My email is acarr, ACARR, at presbyterian.ca. So thank you all for coming, and please do feel free to contact us if you have any questions or would like any more information on this issue. Have a great day.